tell us about some of your favorite interviews.
I'm tomorrow.
From the archives.
Yeah, so Sunday will be my 1,600th show. And honest to God, I can't remember my favorite show. When I look at the list of the guests, if they're staring me in the face, I pretty much remember their program. I may not remember a lot of what is said, but for example, I weekly do a segment for the nationally syndicated radio talk show guy, John Batchelor. Most weekly. I mean, there are times when I don't do it. So lately he's been having me serve as his co-host on something called the Mars Hotel segment, because John loves human spaceflight. So this last Wednesday, I didn't know what we were going to talk about, so he calls me ahead of the show, and he says, we're going to do Mars Hotel number 3 tonight, and you're co-hosting, and Dr. Larry Krauss is going to be with us because he wrote this op-ed about how the shuttle was not, was a dud. I think that was a dud, in a Wall Street Journal op-ed a couple of days ago or last week. And I said, Larry, oh, I remember him. He was on the show in 2005 when he wrote a terrific book, which I still urge everybody to read, called The Physics of Star Trek, where he's a PhD physicist. And he looked at all the stuff in Star Trek, like the warp drive. Everyone looks at warp drive, but shields and phasers, and what was the more advanced weapon that they used other than phasers? I forget what it was called.
Photon torpedoes.
The photon, thank you. And all of this kind. And then he tore them apart scientifically to see if there was any sense of any of this stuff making sense, or could it be replicated, including the food replicator, the scanner for the tricolor coder, whatever it was. So I said, that's interesting. Larry was on in 2005. And so John was having trouble reaching Larry. He was in Australia. So he says, do you have his email address? And so I tracked him down. He's now at Arizona State, where he was at in Cleveland in 2005. And I said, hey, Larry, you were on the show in 2005. You want to return. But in the meantime, John Batchelor's having a hard time getting hold of you. Can you call him? He apparently doesn't have your right code sequence in Australia, and I'm co-hosting with him. So Larry's now coming back on my show in September. So I had forgotten about Larry Krauss being on the show. He has a great new book out on Richard Feynman, and he has another new book coming out. So things like that happen. I mean, I know that's not a direct answer to your question, but I had forgotten that Dr. Krauss was a guest on The Physics of Star Trek, which is one of my favorite books, back in 2005. Was it one of my favorite shows? Probably not, but it was a great show. I didn't go back and listen to it. What are some of one of the most favorite things I did? I like to do walking tours of museums with a tape recorder. So there is, if you were an old timer in the Army Air Corps or in and around World War II, the Army Air Corps base in Wentover, Utah, on the border between Nevada and Utah, was the B-29 training grounds for dropping the bomb. And they would fly from there to the Salton Sea and back, drop empty bombs, and the whole bombardier group was there before it moved to New Mexico. So it is now sort of a dilapidated, run-down, financially starved museum. So I made arrangements with the curator, who came over from Salt Lake City and met me. I drove over there, and we did a walking tour of the old Army Air Force base where they trained to drop the bombs on Japan. And it was like reliving history, because the B-29 hangar where the Enola Gay was hangared, was there, has not changed. There's hills all over. Wendover, that's the name of it, W-E-N-D-O-V-E-R. There's hills all around there. He told me that what they had to do, because there were German and Japanese spies up in the hills with binoculars and telescopes looking down to see what kind of planes were flying out of Wendover. So, I relived this history, and he's on the tape recorder with me. And then we go into the last room, and there's a mock-up in the canister of the bomb, signed by all the crew members. And he's telling me the reaction when they have Japanese tourists come through. Now, why do they have Japanese tourists? Because they probably don't even know about Wendover. Wendover has a civilian airport, and they fly gambling junkets in on 737s for the weekend from different locations, because Wendover, Utah shares the border with Wendover, Nevada, which is one big humongous casino mix and restaurants. So they land at the Wendover Air Base, and they get in buses and they go gamble their hearts out and party and drink and on the Utah side of the border. But they all see what's to do, the things in the room and all that. And a lot of them take the tour to go see this museum of what was there. I love that show. And so I like real history things that I can do like that, rather than just talking to people. I don't get enough opportunities like that, but I do like to do walking museum tours, or I've been to the ATK 5-segment booster test, and I've been able to use the recorder to tell people what I see with the 5-segment booster and the tests that I've seen. And I like those kind of real life history in the making kind of things. As for people that talk, man, I don't know. I've interviewed some really great authors on some books that have just been mind-boggling, and I can't recall all of them, but I've had some good shows and some really horrible shows.
Well, there must have been one. There must be one or two that have really stood out in your mind.
Really stood out. The Columbia Memorial Show stands out in my mind. I had a show scheduled, a regular show scheduled, and then the Columbia accident occurred. Yeah, so I don't remember what day of the week it occurred, but the show was scheduled 3 or 4 days later. So I thought about canceling it, because who wants to listen to a space show about developing space and all that. So I canceled the guest, and I sent out a newsletter, and I said this will be a Columbia Memorial Tribute Show. So I invited all former guests and all listeners to call in on the toll-free line and provide a couple of minutes of whatever they wanted to say about the space program, Columbia, NASA, whatever they thought was relevant. I believe the show is about 2 hours long, or maybe a little longer, and I sent the CDs of it to NASA headquarters. Never got a reply back, but I did send the CDs over to NASA headquarters of the show. But that was a pretty amazing show, and it was nonstop calls. That does stand out. I do like doing things like not because of an accident happened, but I mean in terms of very current, timely type of programming, something like that. I do like doing that. That was a really moving show. It was very moving to host it and to do it, because some of the comments that people were making were unbelievable. Plus, I felt it was really important. And so that show probably stands out among the top 2 or 3, was the Columbia Memorial Show.